his state suffered significantly this past weekend. The town of Sulphur, Oklahoma, essentially was obliterated by a tornado. So certainly our thoughts are with Chairman Cole and members of his community. Also, he's not here yet, but my understanding is that Chip Roy lost a grandmother this weekend, and certainly our condolences go to him and his family. Currently, America is engulfed in a wave of anti-Semitic extremism. According to the Jewish Federations of America, there's been an over 300% increase in anti-Semitic incidents since the horrific attacks of October 7. You need not look any further than our colleges and universities, where the next generation of American minds are molded, to see that deeply disturbing number in action. George Washington University, the anti-Israeli demonstrators held a sign championing the final solution alongside Israel's flag emblazoned with the Star of David. You heard that correctly. In the heart of our nation's capital, and less than a 2-mile walk from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, far-left activists evoked the brutal murder of 6 million Jews. The amount of ignorance and the sheer malice required to reference this horrific time is simply staggering. What's even more concerning is the extent to which this hate has infected institutions of higher learning across the country. At Princeton University, protesters reportedly displayed the flag of Hezbollah. At the University of Pennsylvania, students proudly waved signs in support of another intifada. If you're endorsing a terrorist organization focused on killing Jews or calling for an outright violent uprising against them, you're on the side of hate, not the side of peace. Indeed, this wave of anti-Semitism has also made it incredibly difficult to be Jewish on campus. For example, as Columbia University's radical encampment expanded, Jewish students were encouraged to stay at home and classes were held virtually. As one freshman put it succinctly, as a Jew, I no longer feel welcome on campus. I no longer feel safe on campus. He should be pursuing his dreams in an environment free from fear and hate. Anti-Semitism has destroyed that possibility. It is heartbreaking and simply unacceptable. But it isn't just the students. Faculty members have also suffered because Columbia allowed an unsafe learning environment to fester. The university deactivated the ID of a Jewish assistant business professor because they purportedly couldn't protect his safety amid radical protests. Collegiate administrators will do anything to avoid addressing anti-Semitic harassment on campus, even discriminating against their own employees. This very chamber has witnessed the lengths to which universities and other institutions will go to avoid confronting this troubling reality. Now more than ever, it is critical that the federal government's definition of anti-Semitism is clear and uniform. That is the reason why we're taking up H.R. 6090. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2024 will require Department of Education to consider the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism when enforcing federal anti-discrimination laws. Congress must clearly define anti-Semitism so universities are empowered to take appropriate and decisive steps to keep Jewish students safe and respond to exercises of speech that are so hostile and discriminatory that it is not covered by protections enshrined to the First Amendment. The committee will also consider measures related to our nation's lands. For far too long, the Biden administration has used people when unelected federal officials to enact their radical agenda. Our constituents in American industry have paid the price. House Republicans are committed to ending the weaponization of the bureaucratic state, and that's why we're taking up several bills to roll back executive branch overreach. H.R. 3397, the Western Economic Security Act, will give local communities greater control to administer lands as they see fit. H.R. 764, the Trust the Science Act, delists the gray wolf as an endangered species, marking a successful story of conservation and stewardship. H.R. 6285, Alaska's Right to Produce Act, H.R. 3195, the Superior National Forest Restoration Act, and H.R. 2925, the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act, will remove roadblocks set up by radical officials to hinder American energy production. Finally, H.R. 615, the Protecting Access for Hunters and Anglers Act, will prevent the Biden administration from barring the use of certain ammunition or tackle on public lands. As always, I look forward to the fulsome debate in these important issues, and I would now like to yield to Mr. McGovern for any remarks he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's starting to feel a lot like Groundhog Day because, yet again, Republicans are putting polluters over people. We're here today to consider 6 Republican natural resources bills that brutally attack our bedrock environmental laws and would roll back years of progress. These measures target programs that protect vulnerable wildlife and prevent the exploitation of resource-rich places, while also providing massive handouts to big oil, big gas, big mining, and other industries, all that are very generous contributors to my friends on the other side of the aisle. I mean, give me a break. H.R. 764 undermines science-based recovery plans that help protect endangered species. H.R. 615 ties the hands of federal land managers and puts vulnerable wildlife at risk of lead poisoning. H.R. 2925 upends a crucial federal guardrail in order to provide giveaways to the mining industry. H.R. 3195 reinstates dangerous mining leases that harm tribal communities, poison watersheds, and destroy ecosystems, all to enrich a foreign-owned company. H.R. 6285 undoes steps that have been taken to help protect Alaska from the exploitation of its oil and gas resources. And H.R. 3397 prioritizes oil and gas development over conservation, eliminating a leasing program that allows community groups to conduct mitigation and restoration activities on public lands. All of these measures share one thing in common. They reiterate how the House GOP will do almost any favor for their big industry friends. Republicans would rather help corporations poison our air, dump pollution into our water, and destroy our public lands than preserve our country's natural wonders and unique ecosystems. Thank God that none of these bills will ever become law. You know, Democrats understand the importance of protecting our public lands and overseeing big industry polluters. Congressional Democrats and the Biden administration are committed to making the U.S. a world leader in clean energy. We want to meet the challenges of climate change with real action. We know there is a way to build an economy that works for everyone, one that isn't reliant on fossil fuels, and we will always choose to improve the quality of life of our communities for generations to come. So the choice here is a stark one. Do you want to support our nation's worst polluters by selling out our communities and wildlife? Or will you take a stand against these bills to ensure that we can responsibly protect and manage our country's natural resources? Now, we also have before us a bill called the Antisemitism Awareness Act of 2023. Let me be clear. Anti-Semitism is evil. Members will vote how they want on this measure, but it is my belief that we should be doing everything we can to not just condemn anti-Semitism and express our outrage over anti-Semitism, but to actually give our government the tools it needs to combat anti-Semitism. This bill does nothing of the sort. In fact, this bill basically puts us on a path towards saying that any disagreements with the Netanyahu government's conduct during this conflict is anti-Semitic. As Americans, it is our fundamental right to speak out against actions that we think violate our conscience, whether it's our own government or a foreign one. We are seeing horrific acts of both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in this country, and it is a mistake to not approach these issues with more unifying actions that make a real impact on combating discrimination, hate, violence against anyone. And I just want to close, Mr. Chairman. I heard you say that it is important that this Congress take strong stands against hate. But I'm going to be honest with you. When I look at the agenda of my friends, the anti-LGBTQ agenda, the anti-women's rights agenda, the anti-civil rights agenda, basically trying to undermine our civil rights laws, or the indifference my friends have shown when the former president hangs around with white supremacists like Nick Fuentes. Nothing is said. So this selective outrage is really quite interesting to me. But we should combat hate wherever it is. And again, people will look at this bill and decide whether or not this is the right way to go. But my understanding is that my Republican friends have been working overtime to try to defund the Office on Civil Rights, which I think would be responsible for implementing what is recommended in this bill. Boy, it's interesting. You want to give the office more responsibility on one hand, but you want to underfund on the other hand. I can't quite figure you guys out. But in any event, I welcome our witnesses and look forward to their testimony. I yield back.
The chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses have will be included in the record. I would like to welcome our first panel, Chairman Bruce Westerman and Representative Ocasio-Cortez from the Committee on Natural Resources. Chairman Westerman, I welcome your testimony.
Well, good afternoon, Chairman Burgess, and congratulations. I think this is the first time I've been before the committee that you've been chairing it. I know you've put a lot of work in the committee over the years, so congratulations on your chairmanship, and thank you for this opportunity to testify on behalf of 6 bills, H.R. 615, H.R. 764, H.R. 2925, H.R. 3195, H.R. 3397, and H.R. 6285. I'm excited about talking about what's actually in these bills and how they're good for the environment and good for the economy. But last year, the Biden administration adopted a death by 1,000 cuts approach to restricting access to hunting and fishing opportunities in our nation's wildlife refuges by imposing lead bans in 8 of the national wildlife refuges. H.R. 615, the Protecting Access for Hunters and Anglers Act of 2023, sponsored by Congressman Whitman, would reverse this unjustified ban on lead ammunition and tackle on federal lands and waters. These refuge-specific bans are not supported by scientific evidence that the use of lead ammunition and tackle is harmful to wildlife populations. If these lead bans go into effect, the cost of utilizing lead-free alternative products will be so steep that it will dramatically impact sportsmen and women's participation, turning hunting and fishing on America's public lands and waters, now these are resources that belong to every American, into just pastimes for only the rich. And I also believe this is a backdoor approach to try to go at all ammunition, and it's the left's attempt to restrict Second Amendment rights. Representative Whitman's H.R. 615 fosters a better approach, ensuring federal land managers cannot issue blanket lead bans and instead requiring any restrictions on lead be substantiated by locally specific scientific data that lead is the primary cause of wildlife population decline. The bill also requires any lead restrictions to be in line with the state hunting and fishing regulations. H.R. 764, the Trust of Science Act, sponsored by Congresswoman Boebert, would require the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to reissue the Trump administration's final rule that delisted the gray wolf in the lower 48 states. By every measure, the gray wolf is a recovered species and should be celebrated as an ESA success story. 2 months ago, the service reaffirmed this when it announced that the gray wolves in the western United States have a healthy abundance, retain genetic diversity, can respond to high mortality events, and maintain adaptive capacity. This legislation represents a rare instance where we agree with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The gray wolf is a recovered species. It should be delisted, and Ms. Boebert's legislation will do just that. H.R. 3397, the Western Economic Security Today, or WEST Act, sponsored by Congressman Curtis, nullifies the fundamentally flawed and legally dubious Conservation and Landscape Health Rule finalized by the Bureau of Land Management earlier this month. The rule is nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to lock up more lands to advance radical goals like the Biden administration's 30 by 30 agenda. The BLM manages 245 million acres of land across the West. The BLM rule will cede control of that land to wealthy elites and environmental extremists under the guise of restoration and mitigation leases and new areas of critical environmental concern. If responsible use and development of public lands are prohibited, as the BLM rule proposes, families and small businesses, multi-generation ranches, local communities, and schools will suffer from lack of access to the natural resources in their own backyards. They'll suffer from lost opportunity for economic development and decreased tax revenue. H.R. 6285, the Alaska Right to Produce Act of 2023, sponsored by Congressman Stauber, restores energy authority back to the people of Alaska and prevents the Biden administration from once again kneecapping this critical revenue stream for tribal communities and the state. The Biden administration unilaterally canceled legally mandated leases in the 1002 section of ANWR, threatening the natural resource development that provides essential funding to support public projects and basic services in Alaska Native communities. The Biden administration also promulgated a final rule that would lock up over half of the National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska NPR-A, and prevent oil and gas exploration and production. To quote from the voice of the Arctic Inuit President Ngruk Harchek, the federal government has again excluded the indigenous North Slope Inupiat from policymaking by issuing a final rule for the NPRA that does not reflect our community's wishes. This is a deeply concerning trend by an administration that regularly claims to be the most indigenous-friendly government on record. Again, these are not my words, but the words of Alaska's indigenous people. The Biden administration has issued over 55 executive orders and actions targeting Alaska, locking up their lands and waters and prohibiting the state from accessing their natural resources which they depend on for their survival. Nothing about Alaska is like what we are accustomed to here in the lower 48. If you ever had the opportunity to visit with the former Dean of the House of Representatives, Don Young, Congressman for all of Alaska, you would know just that. Alaska must have the ability to access their resources for their livelihoods. Responsibly developing Alaskan resources supports U.S. energy security and national security. We cannot allow the Biden administration to sanction Alaska time and again, when they should be championing Native communities, local voices, and our national interest by supporting Alaska. H.R. 2925, the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act, sponsored by Congressman Amadei, would reverse a harmful decision made by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which affirmed a lower court decision revoking an approved mine plan for the Rosemont copper mine project in Arizona. This determination upended 40 years of mining regulatory precedent, along with over a century of interpretation of the mining law of 1872. If allowed to stand, this decision would impact all hard rock mining projects on federal lands moving forward, making it even more difficult to access the resources essential to our daily lives, resources we can and should be producing right here in the United States of America, resources that are essential to developing a more carbon-free energy sector. H.R. 3195, the Superior National Forest Restoration Act, introduced by Congressman Stauber, reverses yet another short-sighted decision from this administration. In January 2022, the Biden administration canceled Twin Metals Minnesota 2 decades-old mineral leases in the Superior National Forest and simultaneously began the withdrawal process of over 225,000 acres of mineral-rich land, effectively barring new production of minerals such as copper, nickel, cobalt, platinum, and iron ore. The Biden administration's actions to stop this promising mining project cut deep into the region. The area has a long-standing history and tradition of mining, and area residents state with pride how they and their forefathers mined the iron that made the steel that won World War II. And this is also another area that's very rich in copper, nickel, and cobalt, which are essential in making electric products and electric components. H.R. 3195 would rescind Public Land Order 7917, restore mineral rights to prospective developers in the area, and require the prompt review of any mine plans of operations from potential future development. With China, Russia, and other foreign adversaries aggressively expanding their malign influence across the globe, it's time to say yes in my backyard to safe, reliable, environmentally friendly development of America's abundant natural resources. While the Biden administration continues to restrict access to our public lands and waters and threaten the American way of life, House Republicans are standing up for local communities across America by advancing policies that conserve our resources, expand multiple use, and promote good stewardship in this and future generations. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on a long list of bills, but these are important bills I urge the Rules Committee to report an appropriate rule so that they can be considered on the House floor, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the chair. Thanks, the chairman. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Burgess, the ranking member McGovern, and members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here to testify against the 6 natural resources committee bills that House Republicans are scheduling for the floor this week. You know, Earth Day was just last week, but the celebration is clearly over with Fossil Fuel Week that seems to be presented with many of these bills. It's astounding how House Republicans continue to push an agenda that people are simply not asking for. They voted to cut veterans' benefits, raise costs, and, like we're seeing today, enrich the wealthiest corporations, especially the fossil fuel industry. To the ranking member's point, one good thing that we can say about these bills is that they have no chance of becoming law. They are going nowhere in the Senate. And nevertheless, though, we have 6 bills before us, so let's get into them. H.R. 6285 would fast-track drilling for oil and gas in the pristine Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Bering Sea. We're going to hear about how we need to destroy these places to help with energy prices, but that is simply not true. The United States is already the #1 producer of oil and the #1 producer and exporter of gas. All that has done is increase carbon emissions and enrich an industry that is already seeing record profits. Meanwhile, consumers still face volatile prices. That's for 2 reasons. The first is price gouging by the oil and gas industry, and the second is that oil and gas are global commodities. No amount of endless drilling can shield us from price shocks when OPEC decides to raise prices or when Russia decides to start a war in Europe. If we want energy independence, we should be transitioning to solar, wind, geothermal, and other clean energy sources that aren't subject to those kinds of shocks, and that create good union jobs right here at home. Oil and gas already enjoy an obscene wealth of tax giveaways in this country, special loopholes, and other subsidies as well. But we're supposed to believe that if we continue to let them drill just a little more, that they will finally lower their prices. This is all trickle-down nonsense. This bill is a giveaway to some of the wealthiest and most damaging polluters in the United States. And then we have the mining bills. Our existing mining law is outdated and bad enough as it is. The one frail guardrail that we currently have is that currently a mining claim is only valid if it contains valuable minerals. Makes sense. There has to actually be something there to mine. H.R. 2925 gets rid of that requirement, making it so that anyone can get exclusive rights to our public lands for about $10 per acre per year, permanently locking up almost any public land without there even being a valuable mineral deposit. Then, the claimant can conduct whatever, quote, mining-related activities they want, including burying the land in toxic mining waste. Plus, the bill rolls out the welcome mat for, quote, unquote, nuisance claims by bad actors who want to lock land up from being used for conservation or renewable energy unless someone buys them out. Meanwhile, H.R. 3195 would allow toxic sulfide ore copper mining in the Superior National Forest just outside the pristine Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in Minnesota. The Forest Service already looked into this and concluded that the mine could result in, and I quote, extreme, serious, and irreparable harm to the watershed of this wilderness area. These bills are total giveaways to wealthy corporate polluters. It's climate denialism, pure and simple. That theme continues with H.R. 3397, which would repeal the Bureau of Land Management's public lands rule. The Bureau has a multiple-use mandate that requires striking a balance between all potential uses of the 245 million surface acres of the people's lands that it manages, including commercial, recreational, and conservation activities. The new regulation finally ensures that conservation is on equal footing with uses like oil and gas development, timber, livestock, grazing, and mining. The rule also standardizes and provides guidance for related tools like conservation leases. It does not prevent responsible energy development, including renewable energy projects and building transmission lines. But this bill would repeal the rule because putting conservation on equal footing with fossil fuels is apparently too much to ask. Next is H.R. 764, the Orwellian-named Trust the Science Act. According to this bill, the science says that Congress should silence conservation experts and mandate that the iconic gray wolf be delisted under the Endangered Species Act. Somehow, I think that's not what the science really says. The last time the wolf was delisted, we saw states set up harvest quotas and even cash bounties for killing these animals, even their pups. And finally, we have H.R. 615, which would ban the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service from prohibiting or regulating lead ammunition or tackle on federal lands or waters, even though alternatives do exist that do not poison everything in sight. Right now, we have a climate crisis, student loans burdening our youth and our economy, healthcare costs to deal with, but this set of bills is what Republicans are currently doing in the waning days of their majority. They're putting forward an agenda brought to you by GOP, guns, oil, and polluters. It's not too late to put up a better schedule for the House this week. I oppose these bills and yield back.
Thank you very much. And I just have a couple of questions for Chairman Westerman. So with the proposed rule under 3397, the Western Economic Security Today Act, so we know which one we're talking about since there's a few, would that proposed rule, the proposed rule that's blocked in this bill, would it potentially block mining operations?
Yes, it could block mining operations as well as many other public land uses. And it's misleading because it uses a term that I think we all support, conservation, which is not a use. Conservation is an ethic or an outcome for when you use land. But it's this rule is creating this guise that we're going to lock up land for, quote, conservation, and it could easily be used to stop mining or forestry or any other kind of use on public lands. It could even be used to stop recreation if they wanted to do that.
And is there any estimate that we have of the potential tax revenue losses?
No, CBO was unable to come up with a number on that, but we know it will be substantial if they use this to lock up federal lands. And we've seen this with administration rules that have stopped attack certain areas of multiple use, and industries go away and people lose jobs, and the environment becomes worse than it was before you had people there actively managing with a vested interest in actually practicing conservation.
And so there isn't any way for a community to hold those folks responsible under this?
No. It'll be some bureaucrat here in D.C. saying what happens on rural land all across the country, and the residents that are affected by it will just have to take it.
Yeah, thank you very much. And then just going to the bill regarding delisting, how many species have been delisted after being listed?
Well, and the definition for that is how many species have been recovered? A miserable 3%. 57 out of like 1,700 have been recovered. We could make the gray wolf number 58, and the data shows it's recovered. Fish and Wildlife's data shows that the Endangered Species Act actually worked in recovering the gray wolf, but you've got radical groups that are fundraising off of it that the last thing they want is to see a species actually recovered, because it doesn't give them clickbait or the ability to raise funds or to have a cause to work for. But the science says the gray wolf has been recovered, and we should delist it and celebrate the victory.
Well, and I was going to mention that because in Minnesota, since 2017, in Minnesota, the gray wolf population has stayed equal or above the 2,500, which is well above both the state and federal population targets. So, but I guess overall, why is it so easy to get a species on the list, but darn near impossible to get it off.
Well, I often refer to the endangered species, the listed species as Hotel California because they come in and they don't leave. Because once they're listed, people just, they have a cause. And you have organizations that pop up to raise money off of that, to be activists for it. And if you actually recover the species, you take away their ability to be activists, to raise money. And that's not what the Endangered Species Act was set in. It's not why Congress passed it and the president signed it. It's to actually recover species. And if you measure the results of the ESA on the outcomes, again, it's only 3% of the species that have ever been put on have been delisted. And we can do better.
And I appreciate that. And in Minnesota, for many of my farmers, the gray wolf population increase has been devastating with livestock, loss of livestock, and been to many meetings on it and dealt with it when I was in the legislature. So I appreciate you bringing the bills forward. And with that, I will turn it over to Ranking Member McGovern.
Mr. Ocasio-Cortez, I don't know if you want to add anything, or?
I would just say that it's important to note that the original Trump-era regulation that delisted the wolf was overturned in the courts, and this legislation not just reverses, or rather reinstates that Trump-era rule, but it exempts judicial review once more. And so if the science on this, and if conservationists as well, deems it necessary and the courts uphold that, this bill would prevent the courts from taking objective analysis on it, which I find very concerning.
Well, thank you. And, as I said, and as you said, none of these bills are going anywhere fast. So, we have some really serious issues that we need to deal with, and there are things that, quite frankly, we need to act upon that we're not doing, and instead we are focused in on messaging bills that I guess are good for donors who are polluters, but this is not, in terms of policy, nothing is going to happen here. So this is kind of another colossal waste of time. So I won't waste any more time here. I will yield back and let somebody else waste the time.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Mr. Roy?
I think the chairwoman, my friend, Mr. Westerman, just a couple quick questions. The ranking members talked about somehow this is good for, individuals who are, quote, polluters. I know at least one of the bills we're talking about is important with respect to the Duluth complex, right? And that would, it could constitute a sizable portion. I've got 88% down in my notes, but I know it's a very large percent of the cobalt reserves in the United States. Currently, we're highly dependent on China for cobalt, correct?
Very dependent on China for cobalt and many other minerals and rare earth elements.
And is it not true that the Biden administration, with its senseless, job-killing, hard-working, American, life-destroying tailpipe rule that will stack up more mandates on electric vehicle production to the tune of something like 2/3 of the production by 2030, that meanwhile EVs are piling up on the lots of automobile dealerships across the country, that in light of that even if one were to say that we should be moving towards electric vehicles, which I think is a reasonable question to debate in and of itself, would it not be foolish to do that on the back of Chinese production and Chinese cobalt mining?
I believe so, and I think you've done a great job of outlining what I would call Democrat utopia. We're going to have our cake and eat it too. We're going to get rid of fossil fuel. We're going to get rid of internal combustion engine vehicles. Everybody's going to drive an EV, and we're not going to mine anything to create the components that go into that EV, or to strengthening the grid, or to building wind and solar and more distributed electrical systems. And it just doesn't work that way. It's a not in my backyard mentality, that is forcing our supply chains more and more to China, who has gone out and hoarded resources from around the world. Cobalt is one you mentioned that comes from the Congo, where they
Right.
use child slave labor.
Child slave labor, right?
They haul it back to China where they refine it. And by the way, China built 50 gigawatts of coal-powered plants last year. That's one every 5 days. So they can process the minerals and manufacture the stuff to sell to us so that we can save the planet. It makes absolutely no sense.
Representative Ocasio-Cortez, what do you say to that point, right? When we've got a significant amount of evidence that China owns the vast majority, if not all, 80% plus of the cobalt mine production coming out of Congo, et cetera. And we know, I think it's irrefuted, that there's child labor exploited to get those minerals. Those minerals are central, if not fully necessary, for the production of EVs, which even objectively we have to acknowledge are not fully able to power the ability of the American public to get to their jobs and their work and so forth. And yet we're mandating that we have 2/3 of the production be EVs by 2030. So if we follow those mandates by the Biden administration, that debate aside, right? Debate for a different day. If you follow those mandates, you got to have a massive, massive amount of battery production. And by all indication, the vast majority of that Congo production is controlled by China. A huge amount of that has child labor and other issues that we've talked about. And you got trafficked child slaves that are reported in the production of it. Why on earth would we want to limit the ability of Americans to go mine cobalt? Now, I might say, well, that's kind of great because I actually still want the internal combustion engine. I actually think it's more affordable and better for the American worker who wants the plumber in San Marcos, Texas, to be able to go to work and afford the car. But if you buy into the motion of having, EVs that you can drive all over creation, even if you're from Texas and you had to do like I did, I appreciate the chairman pointing out the passing of my grandma. I had to drive 6 hours, like 300 miles to go see my grandma Thursday before she passed away, and 6 hours back. I couldn't do that in an EV. I wouldn't be able to make the round trip in time. But okay, assume we were able to ever produce the batteries that last long enough, the charging stations, all the stuff. Why would we get rid of the American production of it?
Thank you. There are several different components to your question. I want to make sure that I address them. First and foremost, on the issue of child exploitation, child labor, I think it is the role of the United States for us to push back forcefully on this production, and not just in the production of energy, but across the board. We see this in textile production, energy production, cobalt mining. It is horrific, and we need to make sure that our sources do not include child labor. But to get to the core of the question, too, on the China front, is that I find it interesting that there is this concern about Chinese ownership of minerals, and it is legitimate. However, the response to that seems to be deregulation specifically for companies that are largely Chinese-owned here in the United States. These companies are subsidiaries where the benefit of what we are deregulating here, and I'll give you a specific example. I would be remiss not to mention that the minerals produced specifically at the proposed Twin Metals mine that is implicated in this legislation would most likely be shipped to China for refining and smelting to be sold on the global market. These are not American-owned companies that American mined minerals would be going to. And so if your concern is the Chinese predominance of ownership in the mining market, I would be very concerned about passing this legislation. So that, I think, on the China piece there. And lastly, on the meeting our targets and mining cobalt. I think it's a false choice to say that in order for us to mine cobalt, we either have to destroy some of the most sacred lands in the United States or rely on child labor. There's responsible mining in the United States that is available to us. But secondly, I also find it interesting that the majority presently pushes back against battery recycling, which would allow us to open the path to reducing our reliance on mining in general. There is enormous potential in recycling many of these EV batteries, but we have not made the investments or the shifts necessary in order to unlock that so that we can reduce our reliance on solely mining as the only source of battery. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Before I give my colleague a chance to respond, as I think he probably wishes to, I would only note that happy to have a conversation about restricting Chinese ownership of any number of corporate activities in the United States, or ownership of farmland, or ownership of land near military bases, or frankly, ownership of meat packing, production, including mineral production and so forth. A significant reason why it would be mined here and shipped back is because they've got all the production facilities, because they've been building and mining these because they've got the resources to do that. And here we've got the God-given benefit in America being able to produce very clean burning natural gas, very efficient ability to have automobiles that have an internal combustion engine, which are basically fractionally about a 1.5% of the CO2 production when you compare it to what we're producing in China, as the gentleman noted, where they've got 1,100 coal-fired plants burning in China, and we have 250, and they're building 2 a week, and we're building none. And yet we're building no nuclear plants except for the Georgia plant that was finally put online 45 years after it was permitted by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I think if we're going to be serious about it, we can't say, I just don't accept the premise that this sort of general notion of, well, we got to push back on the child labor. Well, I mean, we're going to use that child labor unless we find a supply right now, because the Biden administration has put their foot on the gas to say we must have EVs in 2030 at the extent of 2/3 of our entire production line. So Toyota is not a Chinese-owned company, but Toyota has a massive production facility in San Antonio, tells me that they will largely have to put their entire assembly line starting next year into EVs pretty much only, because they can't financially afford to do otherwise with these mandates on the tailpipe rule, which will be shutting down the internal combustion engine production of the Toyota vehicles. No Chinese ownership there, because that's where they are, which will then mandate the EVs, driving up the price of those vehicles, and then they got to go figure out how to get the batteries and get the production. I know the gentleman seemed like he wanted to jump in on that, and so I'd like to give him a chance to respond.
I appreciate the opportunity to respond. So many things to talk about here, and I agree with the assertion that we don't have the refining and the smelting capacity in the U.S., but that's self-imposed. You go back to 1995, we produced 3 times the copper of China, and today they produce 11 times more copper than us. They have 50 smelters, and we have 2. That's another area of regulation that's forced business like that out of our country to China, and they're making the things that we need. We're exporting wealth to China to build these projects, and we have the resources that have made this country strong and that are still here to make us strong in the future if we will just use them.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman. I will, in the interest of time, yield back. I know there's other issues here. I would just push back on the general notion that these aren't important pieces of legislation. I mean, dealing with figuring out how we're going to protect our federal lands and the wildlife and the ability for hunters and anglers to use them, all that stuff are all part of this legislation, and we all share an interest in conservation in that respect. Look at Texas. We have very little federal ownership of the land, happily so. But where we have federal lands, we ought to try to manage it appropriately for good stewardship for multiple generations, including production in AMWR, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of the footprint of the entire state of Alaska. Lots of studies about wildlife benefits and so forth, but we'll put that aside for a different day, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am very concerned that these bills are a huge step back for our environment and our endangered species. They seem to be predicated on a false kind of a binary choice, and I don't think it's true that President Biden or Democrats or the American people have any interest in having a blanket prohibition on development, but we do want a system that fairly takes into account public safety, conservation, and the damage to our environment and our children's future if we aren't taking those into consideration. So can you comment on that?
Absolutely, Representative Scanlon. As you noted, particularly in the public land rule, specifically, this shift in the rule is not even to put conservation and restoration above, energy production, recreation, or any other considerations. It's simply to allow the consideration to be on equal footing. And I would emphatically push back on the notion that conservation is just simply cordoning off, that this rule is just about conservation and cordoning off several acres of land and saying there's nothing to be done here. But this is also about land restoration. And there are so many acres of land, federal lands, public lands. This is land that belongs to the people of the United States of America, that has been dumped on, that has been allowed to be overridden with toxic waste, that people are getting sick from, that species are becoming endangered from, and to allow that to simply be in equal consideration as the federal government and the Bureau of Land Management doles out and makes decisions, oftentimes affirmatively about energy production, I think is eminently reasonable.
I think that makes a lot of sense, that we're trying to balance some competing concerns, but that we really do need to take into account these conservation concerns. So I would yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ganlon. Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just be quick. I mean, I'm thankful for the legislation on that supports hunters and fishermen. I mean, I think, the more time a child spends hunting and fishing, the less likely they are to end up in trouble. And so, if, I hear the talk that other alternatives are available, and they are, and there are some species that you're mandated to shoot them on, and I can tell you a tungsten shell costs a whole lot more than a lead shell. And so, you're talking about 4, 5, 6 times the cost. And I don't want to get into a prolonged debate on it, but I certainly appreciate the Protecting Access to Hunters and Anglers Act and look forward to supporting it. With that, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Neguse?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Vice Chair and the Chairman of the, or Vice Ranking Member and the Chairman of the committee for your testimony. I would echo and share the sentiments of my colleague from Pennsylvania that I think these bills in totality are regressive. I don't think that they ultimately achieve the broader conservation missions that I think so many of us care deeply about. As a representative from a state that happens to have a lot of BLM managed and Forest Service managed lands in the state of Colorado, I would say that I don't think these bills, in particular the West Act, but consistent across all of the bills that have been submitted before the committee, are reflective of the views of my constituency and the folks that I'm privileged to represent in Colorado. Mr. Chairman, a couple of questions, I think, with respect to the West Act that I wanted to pose, and I preface this with great respect, as you know, for your leadership and our partnership. But what I'm concerned about with respect to the West Act, I think, is some misinformation that I've seen, at least online, around what this bill does in the context of the BLM rule that's been, or the rule, rather, that's been proposed by the BLM. And my colleague from Pennsylvania, and I think the vice-ranking member, both articulated this as well. I want to make it just absolutely crystal clear. Does the rule that BLM has proposed disallow grazing on BLM-managed lands?
I believe the rule, though explicitly doesn't say it disallows grazing, it's going to make it very difficult for grazing to be a use if the land's set aside for, quote, conservation. And we know that when this administration uses the word conservation, they're really talking about preservation, which means we want to just take everybody off of it, put an invisible fence around it, and somehow it's going to be this lovely place that everybody wants to visit. So that's my concern, is that it just is going to make it, it's going to create barriers for traditional uses and for multiple uses. And again, conservation is not a use. Conservation is an ethic, it's an outcome, and it's something that we should strive for with whatever use that we're doing. If it's a recreation use, if it's a downhill ski slope on federal land, it should be done with the idea of conservation and leaving it better than we found it, making it good for the future generations, and that's what conservation really is.
So I just want to zero in. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to zero in a bit on the language of the rule. I understand your concerns about what you believe to be the collateral impact if this rule ultimately implemented on grazing, let's say, for example. But you wouldn't make the argument that the rule itself does not permit grazing. It's in the, I mean, the plain language of the rule says that grazing is permitted. I understand your argument that because conservation is now included as an equal use, that there will be impacts to grazing. But you're not contesting that grazing is allowed under the rule.
No, I'm not contesting that. I'm just saying it's going to create a barrier to grazing, and it's going to give a bureaucrat another tool to stop some kind of multiple use that you could have conservation and grazing, you could have conservation and forestry management, you could have conservation and recreation. And as I stated before, you should have conservation with any kind of use on the federal land. But it's very vague to say we're going to make conservation the use of the land.
But I guess, Mr. Chairman, and I suppose this will be further gleaned during the debate that we have on the floor about these particular bills, at its most visceral level, I would think the American people would both understand and appreciate a decision made by the Land Management Agency to allow these lands to be used for a variety of different purposes: grazing, conservation, extractive purposes, by the way, are still permitted under the rule, the plain language of the rule. There's nothing in this rule that says you cannot permit drilling, for example, on a particular area of land managed by the BLM. And so I'm struggling to understand the argument that House Republicans are making with respect to the BLM rule. And maybe Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Vice-Ranking Member, would care to expound on that.
Yes, I mean, I would also contest, the notion that conservation is not a use. In fact, it is all about our future use. And the idea that the preservation and ensuring that we are protecting lands for the use of future generations is not a use, I think is very short-sighted. It could potentially, and I think it also sets the stage for an argument that, that the only legitimate use of public lands is short-term. And that, and I think, today's areas of lands that are conserved could be tomorrow's areas of lands that ironically could be grazed or could be used for other forms of production or recreation. And so, to your point and to answer your question directly, this rule does not eliminate grazing as a use, and it does not preclude grazing as a use of federal public lands.
Couldn't agree more, and I think you articulated well why ultimately the BLM rule has been widely supported by so many. Because, again, it's not favoring one use over another. It's simply giving the land management agencies the tools that they need, in particular in the case of this rule, the BLM, the tools that it needs to be able to appropriately manage these lands. And so, Mr. Chairman, I see you, of course,
Well, I would contest and contend that the rule actually does favor one use over the other. The final rule states, and I'm quoting here, leases will not override valid existing rights or preclude other subsequent authorizations so long as those authorizations are compatible with the restoration or mitigation use, end quote. So it is giving a higher authority to the restoration or mitigation use. And that's the concern that I have, is this will be used to trump all other uses on federal lands.
But I suppose, I appreciate you quoting that particular language. You're equating the restoration and mitigation use to the conservation use?
The
language that I read, as I understand it, what you've essentially said with respect to that particular provision of the rule, is that this rule will not impede, for example, a development right on a particular acre of BLM land, right? Unless that somehow contravenes a restoration or mitigation use. Let's say in the context, just real-world consequences here. I represent a wide swath of northwestern Colorado, 12 counties, bigger than 8 states in the United States, bigger than New Jersey, bigger than Maryland, which I remind my colleagues on the Eastern Seaboard about constantly. And as you know, we have the threat of wildfires that is ubiquitous in our area. We've had 2 of the largest wildfires in the history of Colorado happen both in the last 4 years. So to the extent that a development right, a development use on a particular BLM-managed land within my district or my state would somehow impede mitigation work that needs to be done to prevent a wildfire, hazardous fuels reduction, which of course I know you care a great deal about, Mr. Chairman. That to me seems like good planning on the part of the agency. That doesn't seem like, the sort of horror stories that we've heard, not from you, but I think from some others, about what the BLM rule would purport to accomplish.
So I believe this would actually could be used to stop forest management as another example. And the BLM did rename conservation leases to restoration leases in the final rule. They're actually the same. And I want to go back to what the law says, because we're talking about a rule that's being proposed by the bureaucracy based on current law, and the current law under the plain reading of FLTMA says Congress defined the principal or major uses of BLM lands to, quote, include and be limited to domestic livestock grazing, fish and wildlife development and utilization, mineral exploration and production, rights of way, outdoor recreation, and timber production. Nowhere do the words conservation, restoration, or mitigation appear as a use. So the administration is adding to the law. They're saying there's a new use, which, as I've said before, is not really a use. It should be an ethic for all uses, and it's an outcome for those uses that we have.
Well, I would say, and not to belabor the point, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, the argument as to whether or not the BLM has the statutory authority to ultimately engage in this rulemaking is a separate argument than the propriety of the rule that they proposed and the impact that it would have on the lands in my state and in other states across really the Rocky Mountain West in particular. But I hear your argument and I understand. I would just also say that notwithstanding what some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have said about this particular rule, it does have broad-based support. The agency conducted an extensive, robust rulemaking process that included a variety of different public sessions. How do I know that? Because one of them was in my state. Again, because my state will be impacted perhaps in a more pronounced way than some others, east of the Mississippi. So I understand folks have different views about the necessity for this rule. I happen to believe that it's in the best interests of the Rocky Mountain West and of the American people, and that's why I'll be opposing the bill on the floor. But I thank the chairman and the vice-ranking member for the robust debate. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ngoose. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for your testimony. Welcome to the Rules Committee. It's always fun here because it is interesting because we actually do get to debate and to reflect on what are our priorities as a nation. And the last time we were in this room, we were hearing from our chairs and rankings with regards to major national security issues. And the chair of the Foreign Affairs urged this committee and his colleagues to recognize the dangers of China, Iran, and Russia, and the fact that they were intertwined and adversaries of American interests. Chair Wisterman, did you vote for the bill to ban TikTok from operating in the United States unless its Beijing-based company ByteDance divested to an American-controlled company?
I did.
And I'm supposing that you did so because you recognize the security risk to have a foreign adversary like China mining our data on the phones of all of those Americans, correct?
That was part of it, yeah.
Yeah. Are there provisions of the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act that would prevent a Chinese-controlled company from leasing public land or mining our nation's precious metals?
Well, we're working to make sure that that doesn't happen. I know Republicans have proposed a lot of legislation to ban Chinese ownership of American ag land, and we've also got legislation to ban Chinese ownership or use of public lands as well.
Right. But in the mining bill that you are presenting here today, there was an opportunity in the House Natural Resources Committee to specifically state that we would not allow foreign companies who were adversaries, who were bad actors, from being able to take advantage of our antiquated mining laws and take our public lands and our minerals. Is that correct? There was a bill, there was an amendment by Representative Luna, correct?
There was an amendment that we felt was not worded properly. It would have extenuating circumstances to it, so I opposed that amendment. But that is an area that we're willing to work on. But what this bill focuses on is actually using the resources that we have, because right now we're becoming more and more dependent on China. You know, the World Bank said that by 2045, we need to mine more copper in the world than has been mined to date. We're now so far behind China on copper, and we could look at steel, we could look at rare earth elements. They're leading in basically every category. We're dependent on Russia for the nuclear fuel for our nuclear reactors. So we have all of that here, but under the current administration and the current programs and rules, nobody's going to use it. But we would at least have an opportunity for an American company to produce it and for American workers to process it and manufacture it. But we can't do that while it's in the ground.
But this is the problem. When you said we now would have an opportunity for an American corporation to do it, well, the amendments that were proposed in House Natural Resources would have not said, let's make sure it's American companies. Because right now, under the 1872 Mining Act and under the act that is being proposed now, the Clarity Act, Mining Regulatory Clarity Act, we allow all of those bad actors that you have just described to come in, to take American resources, to not pay a dime to the American public in royalties, and to not even have to clean up after themselves and not worry about, and the rest, I am so worried about the amount of water that gets used without any of the oversight that we need. And so those are the issues that I think is important. And it's important that the American public know that there was a specific opportunity. But I will say this, that we have another opportunity to fix that issue. I will be offering an amendment. I have offered an amendment to make sure that we don't allow foreign actors to take our resources without paying us a dime. And there was an opportunity, you could have said that in the Mining Regulatory Act. We said, we're going to now take royalties. But this Mining Regulatory Act does not require royalties to the American public for taking either the minerals that you described that are important for renewable energy, or they're important for all kinds of other things. They do not pay a dime in royalties. Representative Ocasio.
Could I respond to that?
Sure.
Quick? So that's just not true to say that we're going to allow people to come in and mine and not clean up. We have the best mine reclamation program in the world, and that's just not going to happen, that a company is going to come in and mine in the U.S. and not clean up after themselves and do reclamation. We're also talking about a point that's often lost. This mine in Minnesota is an underground mine, so it's not strip mining. It's not, and it's not the mining practices that are trying to be painted of this, saying it's going to destroy the Boundary Waters canoe area. Again, this is providing access to U.S. elements and minerals that are much needed. The company that's wanting to develop the minerals said they would process them in the United States. So they're not going to be shipped overseas to be processed. They're going to build the processing facility there if they could ever get it permitted, which is a whole nother issue when you try to start permitting a manufacturing facility.
So I think the representative wants to speak to the issue about is there a requirement in the law for the cleanup and how that often happens, but I'm going to yield to my ranking member.
No, and I just wanted to point out for the record, because I love these guys with all their excuses of why things are not in the bill. And if I heard the gentleman correctly, he said that he didn't accept the amendment that you were talking about, the Lunar Amendment, because it was poorly drafted. It's just hard to believe that between that committee meeting and now, we couldn't have drafted an amendment more properly or worded the exact way so that your concern would have been addressed. And I just, I mean, there's always an excuse why we're not doing things, but a poorly drafted amendment, or we didn't agree with the wording of the amendment, when you could have changed the wording, and you could have taken care of the issue that the gentle lady raised. I just wanted to point that out for the record.
But also, I mean, because if you care about this, and this is the problem, is we keep hearing from the Republicans that they're about America first, right? We keep hearing that they're not, that they want to take on China. But then when they have a chance, they do not do it. This bill does nothing to stop China or Russia or any other foreign corporations. As much as I might like Canada, Canadian corporations are some of the biggest corporations mining our resources and not giving the American people a dime. And that's what bothers me about this. All kinds of things that bother me. But Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you wanted to respond to some of this.
I mean, Representative Fernandez, you've encapsulated so much of what is wrong with the general thrust of many of these bills. And to your point, this is not about what many in the Republican majority are putting forward is not about America first. It's about America to the highest bidder. And it's about America to whoever is willing to pay the most. And the idea that federal public lands that belong to the American people of the United States could potentially be given away to any foreign company. And then when you importantly put that together with another one of the bills that are proposed today, which is the complete deregulation of mining in the United States, where they don't even have to prove that there is a valid claim to a mineral in a space. This can very seriously be used for dangerous purposes that I think are counter to U.S. national security, including our energy security. We have to transition to renewable energy and to a built-up grid in the United States, which includes building out new energy transmission lines. And imagine a scenario where a foreign-owned company in the United States knows that we domestically are trying to build out our energy grid and build out an energy transmission line that requires going through federal land, and they decide to stake that plot in order to avoid and prevent the development of energy transmission lines in the United States. It could slow down our grid, and there's so many different ways that this could go sideways if we don't put a check to this right now. And we have to make sure that we're both engaging in conservation, engaging in restoration, but also engaging in responsible use in our responsibility to be proper stewards on behalf of the American people of our federal lands.
Yeah, I think that what we are looking at today really prioritizes the biggest, wealthiest corporations, yet again, mining corporations, whether they be American or foreign, over public interest. This is public land, American land. And Americans deserve to get paid when you take stuff out of it, because that's our minerals. Those are our resources.
One last note, Representative, on the idea that the boundary waters and the deregulation around that is not of concern. There is currently mining in that area of taconite, but we're talking about expansion of this mining into elements like copper sulfide, which are far more toxic. And the fact that they are underground near waters, boundary waters, is actually quite alarming, if not more alarming than otherwise. So I yield back.
And I would also point out that the issue of what is being proposed here by the Republicans is not supported by their constituents. So there was a poll of over 70% of Minnesotans support proposed legislation to permanently protect the boundary waters from risks associated with sulfide or copper mining. Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record that poll.
So ordered.
Without objection.
Without objection, sorry. I was.
I would also point out that there's another poll that 82% of voters support the conservation of our public lands and waters. Madam Chair, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record that poll.
Without objection.
And I think it's really important that that because when we talk about conservation, like I remember when Republicans were like the first conservationists, right? That wonderful Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, that talked about conservation as being part of a moral duty of Americans and recognizing that conservation is patriotic, precisely because we're preserving our lands for the future generation. And then I'd like to also enter into the record, the Biden administration's public lands rule received 90% supportive public comments. Madam Chair, if I may.
Without objection.
Thank you so very much. And I think it's really important to recognize that that the public lands rule was in consultation. It wasn't Congress deciding one thing, right? That there was this public consultation with the ranchers and farmers who are impacted, with the indigenous people, with the communities who often rely on the public lands for wonderful things like recreation. And the chairman has a wonderful bill that he got passed out of the House about getting out and exploring. But utilizing our public lands and near public lands to some of our national parks and forests, protecting those areas is key. And that's why Americans are supportive of these rules that look at all of it, that are engaging. It's not Congress from up high here in DC forcing stuff down on the American public's throat about the lands they hold precious. I will say I was up in the Pecos, which is a place where there was a foreign mine, and it made a mess. We love fishing, and all those fish were dead. You could not fish for decades. That foreign corporation got up and left. And it took decades for the state to clean it up. And those are the things that are real. And I had with me on a 5-hour hike up into go look at that land, ranchers and farmers who were very opposed to future mining in that area, who were very supportive of conservation because they recognize that conservation could often be very important for grazing land as well. They are original conservationists. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. All right, so we are done with this panel, and thank you for appearing with us today, and the witnesses are excused. I would like to welcome our second panel, Representative Russell Fry and Ranking Member Jerry Nadler from the Committee on the Judiciary. Representative Fry. Thank you very much, both of you, for being here. And Representative Fry, welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am here to testify regarding House Resolution 6090, a bill designed to combat the deeply disturbing trend of anti-Semitic harassment in schools, colleges, and universities across the country. Anti-Semitic harassment on college and university campuses is not a new phenomenon. As early as 2005, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights warned that campus anti-Semitism had become a serious problem. In 2013, a Pew Research survey of Jewish Americans found that experience with anti-Semitism was more prevalent among younger adults in higher education. In 2014, a Brandeis Center Trinity College study found that anti-Semitism was particularly pervasive on college campuses, with 54% of Jewish students on 55 campuses having reported that they experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism during the 2013-2014 academic year. In 2021, the Lewis Brandeis Center for Human Rights under law conducted a survey of Jewish fraternity and sorority students, finding that most have felt unsafe at some point while on campus or in virtual or campus settings. These fears are justified. The catalog of anti-Semitic harassment in America's top institutions of higher learning is everywhere to see. You just have to turn on the television today. These incidents have increased sharply following the October 7th terrorist attacks in Israel perpetuated by Hamas and their allied groups. In late October of 2023, at Cooper Union in New York, visibly Jewish students were forced to shelter inside a library as pro-Palestinian protesters tried to gain entry, banging on doors and windows to terrify them. In October 26, 2023, anti-Israel protesters assaulted multiple Jewish students at Tulane University in New Orleans. In November of that year, a Harvard law student and other anti-Israel protesters physically and verbally attacked a first-year Israeli student at Harvard Business School while he pleaded with them to stop. From October 7th until mid-January of this year, the Department of Education has launched 51 investigations into complaints alleging discrimination based on actual or perceived shared ancestry in K-12 schools, colleges, and universities. From January 16th to today, the department has launched over 45 investigations into those schools and colleges. These investigations overwhelmingly concern anti-Semitic conduct at these schools, and in fact, in April of this year, the Education Department launched an investigation into Columbia University, and we all know and see what is happening there today. Hundreds of anti-Israel protesters have occupied Columbia University's West Lawn and erected tents, it's a tent city, disrupting campus life and creating a hostile environment for Columbia's Jewish students. Hundreds of pro-Hamas students were arrested for trespassing after repeated warnings to vacate the area, only to be released and to return back to Columbia. A rabbi at Columbia's Orthodox Union Jewish Learning Initiative has advised Jewish students to leave campus before the university has shown that it cannot keep them safe. Columbia revoked the campus access of a Jewish professor who has been critical of school administrators because the university said it couldn't ensure his safety. Speaker Johnson, Chairwoman Fox, Republican members of the New York delegation went to Columbia University just last week, and while addressing the campus were greeted by anti-Israel chants, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." We know that this expression is a call for the destruction of Israel and her people. Mr. Chairman, enough is enough. The surge in the ancient bigotry of anti-Semitism over the years, but especially since the attacks on October 7th, must not continue. It is long past time that Congress act to protect Jewish Americans from the scourge of anti-Semitism on campuses around the country. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act expresses the sense of Congress that discrimination against Jews may violate Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 when it's based on race, color, or national origin, which can include discrimination based on actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics. The bill requires the Department of Education to take into account the 2016 International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism as part of its assessment of whether anti-Semitic discrimination has occurred. The IHRA definition provides a consistent framework for the Department of Education, schools, colleges, and universities to apply to police anti-Semitic discrimination and harassment. The IHRA's definition is widely accepted and a vital tool for identifying and addressing discriminatory conduct that is motivated by anti-Semitism. It has been adopted by at least 33 states, South Carolina being the most recent one when the governor signs it into law, and multiple countries, dozens of countries. This bill is exactly the type of legislation needed to protect Jewish students from harassment and attacks for simply being who they are. And I welcome your questions, and I yield back.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Madler.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify about H.R. 6090, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2023. I've devoted much of my life to combating anti-Semitism, and I am as attuned as anyone to threats and bigotry aimed at Jewish people. I will take lectures from no one about the need for vigorous efforts to fight anti-Semitism on campus or anywhere else. I'm also a deeply committed Zionist who firmly believes in Israel's right to exist as a homeland for the Jewish people. But as someone who is also a longtime champion of protecting the principle of freedom of speech, I must oppose this misguided bill. While there is much in the bill that I agree with, its core provision would put a thumb on the scale in favor of one particular definition of anti-Semitism that it calls on the Department of Education to use when assessing whether anti-Semitic intent motivated certain conduct and whether that conduct violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, based on a person's actual or perceived Jewish ancestry. This definition, adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA, includes, quote, contemporary examples of anti-Semitism, close quote, particularly with respect to criticism of the State of Israel. These examples can include protected speech in some contexts. To be clear, I vehemently disagree with the sentiments toward Israel expressed in those examples, and too often criticism of Israel does in fact take the form of virulent anti-Semitism. Many Jewish students no longer feel safe on campus, and some colleges have not done nearly enough to protect them. But while this definition and its examples may have useful applications in certain contexts, especially when used in conjunction with other available definitions of anti-Semitism as part of a comprehensive and effective approach to combating anti-Semitism, by effectively codifying them into Title VI, this bill threatens to chill constitutionally protected speech. Speech that is critical of Israel alone does not constitute unlawful discrimination. By encompassing purely political speech about Israel into Title VI's ambit, the bill sweeps too broadly. As the American Civil Liberties Union notes, if this legislation were to become law, colleges and universities could end up suppressing protected speech, criticizing Israel, or supporting Palestinian rights to avoid Title VI investigations or the potential loss of federal funding. Moreover, it could result in students and faculty self-censoring their political speech about Israel or Palestinians. Indeed, the IRA definition's lead author, Ken Stern, shares these concerns about codifying this definition, which he wrote. Unfortunately, the Judiciary Committee never had the opportunity to consider this legislation in a markup where some of these concerns could have been aired. Instead, the bill is being rushed to the floor in a cynical effort to exploit for political gain the divisions currently being played out on college campuses across the country. Not only will this bill not heal the deep wounds that have been exposed, but it also does nothing to actually combat anti-Semitism on campus. Vigorous enforcement of civil rights laws does not depend on defining terms like anti-Semitism or racism. So long as the discrimination in question was on the basis of a protected characteristic, it is unlawful. In fact, codifying one definition to the exclusion of all other possible definitions, which the bill's findings make clear is the intention of its sponsors, could actually undermine federal civil rights law because anti-Semitism, like other forms of bigotry, evolves over time, and future conduct that comes to be widely understood as anti-Semitic may no longer meet the statutory definition. To be clear, the steady rise in anti-Semitism in our country over the past several years is a real and disturbing trend, a trend that has been supercharged following the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel by Hamas. In testimony before a Senate committee several weeks after the October 7th attack, FBI Director Christopher Wray testified that anti-Semitism in the U.S. was reaching, quote, historic levels, and that the FBI's statistics would indicate that for a group that represents only about 2.4% of the American public, Jewish Americans account for something like 60% of all religious-based hate crimes. There is no excuse for bigotry, threats, or violence directed at anyone, anywhere, and it is imperative that we confront the scourge of anti-Semitism. And Congress can help, but H.R. 1690 is not the answer. Instead of engaging in political theatrics that do not do anything concrete to stop anti-Semitism on campus, we need to put our money where our mouth is. Last year, the Biden administration outlined a comprehensive national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, a cornerstone of which was increasing enforcement actions by the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education, the federal agency responsible for enforcing anti-discrimination laws that protect students. President Biden's budget called for a 27% increase in funding for that office, but funding remained level for FY 2024. If my Republican colleagues were serious about this issue, they would have fully funded that request. Instead, they bragged about proposing to slash funding for the Office of Civil Rights by 25%, and ultimately insisted that funding be kept flat, despite the marked increase in complaints of anti-Semitism. If my Republican colleagues were serious about anti-Semitism, we would be considering Ms. Manning's legislation to codify the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism today, instead of fiddling around with definitions. Their promises about combating anti-Semitism and their actions disconnect in other telling ways as well. If my Republican colleagues were serious about anti-Semitism, They would have spoken up after the deadly 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where neo-Nazis chanted that, quote, "Jews will not replace us." If my Republican colleagues were serious about anti-Semitism, they would have spoken up when President Trump then declared that there were, quote, "very fine people on both sides," unquote, of that rally. Or just last week, when he tried to minimize the seriousness of the Charlottesville rally by saying that it was a peanut, in quotes, compared to ongoing campus protests regarding the Israel-Gaza war. We hear nothing from our Republican colleagues when some conservatives repeatedly invoke George Soros as a sinister Jewish financier allegedly orchestrating a global conspiracy of left-leaning political causes, a modern-day iteration of an ugly and long-standing anti-Semitic trope. It used to be the Rothschilds, now it's George Soros. I say to my Republican friends, for too long, your selective silence on these matters has been deafening. If you mean what you say here today, if you believe that the threats and vitriol that Jewish students face on college campuses is unjust, and that combating anti-Semitism is more than a convenient talking point in your politically motivated crusade against institutions of higher education, then I beseech you, please move beyond pointless gestures and posturing and actually help us protect Jewish students. Fully fund the Office for Civil Rights and the administration's efforts to counter anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination. President Biden's FY 2025 budget request once again includes an increase in the office's funding. We should grant that increase. Our nation's students deserve no less. By contrast, H.R. 6090 threatens freedom of speech, one of our most cherished values, while doing nothing to combat anti-Semitism. For these reasons, I urge the committee to oppose H.R. 6090, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. Thank both of you for your testimony. Mr. Nadler, can I just ask you, you made the point that this evolves over time, but then also the point has been made repeatedly that things have gotten markedly worse since October 7th. So something that evolves over time, but now is markedly worse. What are you hearing from your constituents? I mean, this involves your area. You're their representative. What are you hearing from your constituents?
I have probably the largest Jewish
Yeah, well, what are you
district in the
hearing
country.
from your constituents?
I'm hearing from my constituents that they want the government to do something about the anti-Semitism. They don't know exactly what, but they want to do the government to do
If
something.
I may, that's why we're here today.
And I know that we have two choices. The committee has two choices today. H.R. 6090 fiddles around with definitions. There's a lot of nice whereas clauses in it, and it enacts the IRA definition. It specifically also rejects two other definitions. All the definitions ought to be used, and since it evolves over time, maybe other definitions. The real thing we ought to be doing is increasing the funding for the enforcement mechanism against anti-Semitism, which is to say the Office of Civil Rights, which is in charge of enforcing Title VI, and we ought to be increasing that budget. And the president last year proposed increasing that budget. The Republicans proposed decreasing it by 25%. The compromise was it remained flat. The president has again proposed, I think, a 25% increase. And what we ought to do is pass a 25% increase in the budget for the OCR.
For me to be clear, then, your constituents are calling you and saying if you will increase the funding for the Office of Civil Rights, these problems will be ameliorated.
No, my constituents are calling me and saying, do something.
Do something. And
They don't know
again,
what to do.
I stress, that's why we're here. Mr. Fry, would you care to respond to that?
Chairman, thank you for the opportunity. I think definitions are important. I think when you look at any number of bills that you do in the state legislature or in Congress, they are often terms that are defined, and the purpose is to create clarity within the law. I think that this is a unique opportunity to do this. This was an executive order originally under President Trump, which has been carried under with President Biden as well. But the importance of it is, and again, I don't think I don't think this alone solves the issue, but I do think that it's important to clarify it. And I've read the statements, I think, of others who oppose it. Certainly, the ranking member on Judiciary has his reasons for doing so. But I look at the number of states, 35 34, 35 states that have passed this. I look at the number of countries, over 40 since 2016. And I'm not seeing, and I haven't seen, the level of hysteria manifested in real time on some of the concerns that I'm seeing brought up by the ranking member. And so I think it's important. I think other countries have used this definition, and I think it does provide a modicum of clarity to the issue, is that Congress needs to say what its will is. Whatever that definition may be, it needs to define what this is, because it provides clarity to the agencies. The agencies aren't elected. They're the bureaucrats that carry out the intent of Congress and the executive branch. So providing this definition, as other states have done, as other countries have done, I think is a step in the right direction.
Mr. Chairman, may I comment on? The IRA definition is a definition. It's a useful definition. There is a nexus definition. There is a Jerusalem definition. This bill says, it codifies the IRA definition and says don't use the other two definitions. We ought to use all three of them, and none of them should be codified into law because things change. The chief author of the IRA definition, Kenneth Stern, said this. He said it shouldn't be codified. The IRA definition and the Jerusalem definition and the nexus definition give examples of things that could indicate anti-Semitism, but under certain circumstances might not. Codifying one definition, codifying any definition is a bad idea. Codifying, as Mr. Stern, the author of the IRA definition himself said, which is this bill would codify the IRA definition, and its own author, that is the IRA definition's author, Mr. Stern, has said it shouldn't be codified. Not to mention the fact that it rejects, for reasons I don't understand, the other two definitions. All these definitions give examples of things that could indicate anti-Semitism. To say, let's use this, but not those, makes no sense.
But just reclaiming my time, this strikes me as very similar to language we saw from Peter Roscom in the 115th Congress when he introduced a bill very similar to this, and you were a co-sponsor of that bill in the 115th Congress. So I acknowledge the difficulty here, but Mr. Fry, I really appreciate the fact that you've given us such a reasoned approach. This has not, I mean, obviously the problem didn't just start last October 7th, but it has reached a crisis proportion in this country, and I agree that we need to do something. Mr. McGovern, I'm happy to recognize you for your questions.
Well, Mr. Fry, just to follow up on Mr. Naller's point, do you favor a 25% cut in the Office of Civil Rights, which your party has been advocating for? Have you changed your mind on that now?
Well, I think what's important is what's in front of me here, Mr. Ranking Member.
And I appreciate that, but if I'm reading this bill, and correct me, either one of you if I'm wrong, that the office that would be tasked with carrying out this bill, the office that enforces Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, is the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. Is that correct? Is that what this bill says? So what I'm told is that complaints received by that office have more than tripled in the past 15 years and continue to rise. And Mr. Nadler pointed out that the Biden administration requested $162 million for the Office of Civil Rights for fiscal year 2025, which is a $22.4 million increase. And Republicans actually want to cut funding for the Office of Civil Rights by $35 million last year, which is a 25% cut. So I'm just simply saying, given, and not just in the era of anti-Semitism, but the demands, the complaints that this office is receiving is skyrocketing. And now my Republican friends are advocating we're advocating a 25% cut. Have you now rethought that? And are you now not going to advocate for a cut and maybe work with President Biden to get, more money for the office so that they can actually do enforcement? Otherwise, it seems that this is more just like a talking point and not real. So will you pledge to work in a bipartisan way to increase the funding for that office?
Well, what I do is I always pledge, and this is for my constituents too, to work in a bipartisan way when it makes sense. I haven't reviewed the merits of that budget proposal personally, so I'm not going to weigh one way or another. But I do think it's important, sir, that you provide that clarity in the law. And again, I don't think that this is a panacea that that solves the entire problem by itself. But what I do think is that states have led. And in South Carolina, there was a Democrat that proposed this bill. She was the lead member that proposed the bill. It passed unanimously in the House, in a Republican House, unanimously in the Senate, in a Republican Senate, signed by the governor soon. So I think it is a way.
So in answer to my question, you don't know whether you want to cut the Office of Civil Rights or not. Is that a fair?
Well, what I will say is that I think that it's important for any government agency, when they exist or how they exist, that they use the tools that they have to perform the services for the American people that they require.
But we know that the number of complaints being received by this office is on the rise. And we know they don't have enough, even before all this happened, enough to be able to do the enforcement and the investigations that they wanted to. So I don't, this is not a trick question. It's just basically, the same old, which is, we'll pass a resolution and we'll pass a bill that says all this stuff, but there's no money for enforcement. Let me ask you a question. If I heard you correctly in your opening statement, you talked about pro-Hamas protesters on college campuses. I just want to give you a chance to be able to clarify that. You're not insinuating that everybody who's protesting or who's encamped on a college campus protesting what is going on in the Middle East is pro-Hamas or anti-Semitic, are you?
No, I'm not suggesting that that everybody is, but I would say that if you look at the TV, as I have, it is alarming to see the level of conduct by some of these students and agitators that are present.
I would encourage you to actually go to some of these campuses and talk to some of these students. I was at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst the other day. A number of the students I talked to, by the way, who are in these campuses are Jewish students. And so you're not implying, I hope, that those who are opposed to Prime Minister Netanyahu's policies are somehow anti-Semitic or pro-Hamas. People who are upset with the 33,000 Palestinian deaths right now. You're not. I just want to make sure that we're understanding each other.
No, I don't think it's everybody. But if you look at what is going on and some of the chants that are from the river to the sea and some of the signs that are happening, some of the very ostentatious and ridiculous things that these students are doing, I would absolutely clarify that as anti-Semitic.
And what I just curious. I don't know if you know this or not, but in January, Prime Minister Netanyahu declared that, quote, Israel has to control the entire area from the river to the sea, end quote. How do you interpret that? I mean, is that okay for him to say?
I think it's very different. The context is very different when you look at the intent of that chant.
Well, what is the intent? What is the intent of what the Prime Minister is saying?
Look, Israel has existed as a country for
right, but does that mean that they take over all of Gaza and push the Palestinians out of Gaza? Does it mean no two-state solution? I mean, I'm just trying to understand. I mean, he's not the only one, by the way, in his government that has used that phrase, and I'm just curious, do you find that acceptable, or do you find that okay for him or any official in his government to say?
I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has done, given the circumstances, a pretty remarkable job trying to hold together what is the nation of Israel. You have people coming there, you have families that were butchered on October 7th, and trying to pull together a country to focus on that, I think, is remarkable. And I certainly don't pretend to think that everything in war is perfect. But what I will say is that the borders of Israel are the borders of Israel, and they have controlled them for a number of years. So I'm not going to comment on something that Netanyahu said, but what the statements on college campuses about the river to the sea, the context of those are to push the state of Israel out. And the problem with the Palestinian Authority up to this point has been that they have neglected to even engage on a two-state solution. I mean, I just came back from Israel.
Well, as you know, I mean, let's go back to Gaza. I mean, what we do know, which is public, is that Prime Minister Netanyahu knew from Qatar that, because he was asked well before this about continuing to provide support for Hamas, and he gave the green light to that. And so, here we are. I think part of it was no one would expect the Prime Minister of Israel to negotiate with Hamas, which is a horrific, awful terrorist organization. There's no doubt about that. But the bottom line is, it seems like it was all kind of set up. I
Mr.
get.
Ranking Member.
Yes, I yield to the gentleman.
Thank you. Prime Minister Netanyahu was asked, and this is prior to October 7th,
Right.
by the Qataris, if I'm pronouncing that correctly,
Qataris, yeah, that's okay, close, yeah.
was asked by the Qataris whether they should continue giving money to Hamas.
Right.
He said yes. And the reason was that he wanted to set up Hamas as a countervailing power to the Palestinian Authority so that there could be no two-state solution, so that Israel would be from the river to the sea, and there would be no recognition of the rights of the Palestinian people. That is what he wanted to do. It was a terrible it was wrong morally, but it was a terrible miscalculation because of what Hamas showed on October 7th.
Look, anti-Semitism is vile, is horrific, goes against everything that we as a people.
He was saying,
Yeah, right.
fund an anti-Semitic organization.
And I agree, and that's much of the protest against Mr. Netanyahu. By the way, you talk about him pulling his country together. There are massive protests in the streets of Israel, even now, protesting Prime Minister Netanyahu's leadership, and many of the families of the hostages, in particular, have been particularly outspoken. So I don't see him. I don't see him as the unifier that you do. But I'm simply saying that on the subject of anti-Semitism, it is vile, it is unacceptable, it is hate. It goes against everything that all of us believe is acceptable in any way, shape, or form. And we should be able to come together with a resolution that gets 435 members of Congress voting yes. I mean, that would be the strongest statement against anti-Semitism. And instead, we get these bills. Can I ask you, Mr. Nadler? I mean, during the hearing and markup on this bill in the Judiciary Committee, what was? Can you give me some of the amendments?
As I mentioned, there was no hearing and there was no markup.
Yeah, and again, it's like really, I mean, the idea that the Judiciary Committee didn't even have a markup or a hearing on this, that we couldn't bring people together and come to a bill where everybody is in agreement on this piece of legislation, where if there were amendments that wanted to be made in order. I mean, and again, I go back to what I said in the beginning, and I'll end here. The office that enforces Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which this bill basically says will be the office that will enforce this, is the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. And complaints received by that office have more than tripled in the past 15 years. And my Republican friends come here, and we can't even get a definitive statement that you won't cut it anymore, that you will actually vote to provide additional funds. If you want to really enforce anything, you have to provide the funding to be able to get it to us. I think your staff is handing you a note, so I'll let you. I don't know if that's a response for. No? Okay. All right. Well, anyway, I don't have any further questions. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. To equate when the Israelis say that they want control from the river to the sea to the genocidal call of the pro-Hamas group saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is completely laughable. And we know it's laughable because of this. In the areas that the Israelis control now, there are Arab Israelis. In fact, 20%, roughly 20% of the population in Israel is actually Arab Israelis. There's been zero genocide. But when the Palestinians, the pro-Hamas protesters say from the river to the sea, that is a call for genocide. And we know that because if you look in the areas that are controlled by Hamas, there are zero Jews living there of their own accord, zero. The Jewish population in Gaza, minus the hostages that are still being held, are zero. So that is the difference between the two. When the two groups talk about it, one group is talking about having control, political control. The other group is talking about basically ethnic cleansing the Jews from the area. Mr. Nadler, from my understanding, your main objection to this is the IRA language. Is that correct?
It's the IRA language and the provision that excludes the other two definitions that are extant. Let me just comment on one other thing, by the way. when the Palestinians use from the, or rather say, from the river to the sea, Palestine, that may very well be genocidal. But you can't cite as evidence that there are no Jews living in Gaza, because there were Jews in Gaza, and Prime Minister Sharon in 2005 decided to withdraw the settlements. So that was an Israeli decision.
No, you're correct on that, and that worked out from what, I mean, clearly I'm being sarcastic, in that there was a withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and that area was 100% controlled by the Palestinians, which still led to the attacks of October 7th. But again, so your main,
Which simply shows what a genocidal, horrible organization Hamas is.
Yeah, we agree on that. So you're basically saying that because this bill precludes the other two definitions, you can't support it?
Because it precludes the other two definitions, and frankly, because it codifies the IRA definition. And the author of the IRA, or the chief author of the IRA definition, Ken Stern, says it shouldn't be codified. If you read the definitions, they give examples of things that could be anti-Semitic. To codify them into law is to say, as anti-Semitic, what may in some contexts be, and in some other contexts may not be.
So
Therefore, it's inaccurate.
So you would not support a bill that codified the IRA language?
No.
Okay. Are you aware that there was a bill in the 115th Congress called the Antisemitism Awareness Act?
By which you mean the
Peter Oskin bill?
I don't remember who sponsored it, but I think Mr. Burgess, Chairman Burgess referred to it. Yes.
Yeah.
And I co-sponsored it for a reason that differs. It didn't exclude the other two definitions, and I was mistaken to do so then, in any event.
Okay, so do you regret co-sponsoring
Yes.
that? Okay.
Yes, but it was still better than the current bill because it did not include language excluding the other two definitions.
Okay, but you agree that the language is roughly the same between the bill that you co-sponsored in the 115th and
No,
this
it
one?
was, it codified the IRA definition. It did not include the paragraph in this bill that says specifically you shouldn't use the other two definitions because they are harmful in some way.
Do you want me to read you? I have the definitions. I can read them to you if you want.
It's not the point. Read that paragraph. I mean, I have nothing to disagree with the specific definition. The definition, its own author says it shouldn't be codified into law. It gives examples of things that that indicate anti-Semitism, but not necessarily in every case.
I guess, what I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around is the fact that you're saying that you're not supportive of this bill because the IRA definition is being codified, yet in the 115th Congress, there was virtually identical language that also had the IRA definition that you not only support, you were a co-sponsor.
As I said, there were two things. One, it did not have the paragraph that in this bill excludes the Nexus and Jerusalem definitions. And two, I think in retrospect, I was mistaken in co-sponsoring it then.
All right, that's fair. Thanks for admitting that. Mr. Fry, do you have anything additional that you would like to add on this topic?
Thank you, sir. I think that we're talking about the definition. I think the Jewish League, there's a letter in here, said that as prominent scholars of anti-Semitism have said, the IRHA's definition is the gold standard of defining anti-Semitism. And I think that's really important. I think, again, I go back to just the fundamentals of this. You have two presidents, American presidents, that have done this in an executive order, starting with President Trump and now President Biden. You have 35 states that have done this. You're not seeing, in some of these states that are listed, New York, Texas, some of these states are right now what is going on these college campuses, and you're not seeing the fallout that is being predicted by the ranking member. And I think that, again, that's important. And two things in my mind, and I'm sure that Mr. Massey will have some questions on this too, but two things in my mind that strike me civil liberties. One is the text of the bill itself. The text of the bill itself says it's not going to go against the civil liberties, and to the extent that there is an outcry that this is going to chill freedom of speech on college campuses, you also look at the definition itself, which says criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. And so I think there the importance of having the definition provides that clarity to an agency that, in my mind, to this point, has not provided that even hand of justice when examining these cases that are popping up on college campuses, particularly since October 7th?
Yeah, I think what you can really point to for anti-Semitism is the fact that for about a decade now on college campuses, there's been a crackdown on free speech. The fact that the belief that speech is violence, if you misgender somebody, you can be expelled from school. All of that speech is cracked down upon. Yet the second you call for the genocide of Jews, the second that you say that you don't feel comfortable with Jews in campus, then at that point, that's when they decide that there is a First Amendment protection of freedom of speech. So the application of the freedom of speech vis-a-vis speech that they agree with, which is the woke agenda, et cetera, with these anti-Semitic remarks and the tolerance for the anti-Semitic remarks, that's what shows you the anti-Semitism of these colleges and universities, correct?
100%. I mean, look at Harvard, for God's sakes. I mean, they just, thankfully, that ship seems to be righting itself a little bit, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think, unfortunately, these administrators have propped up this this culture on their campus that it's okay if it's a certain group of people, that you could kind of target them, and it's kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod. I just have a huge problem with that. And again, no one's going to argue. I've had a problem with some of the conduct of college campuses even before October 7th, when you look at freedom of speech issues. And now all of a sudden, it's an outcry. Well, I'm sorry, you're shutting down schools, you're intimidating students, locking them in the library, you won't let Jewish professors onto campus, you can't protect the safety, you're canceling commencements. I mean, it is obscene what is happening, and it's not just one school, it's a myriad of them. And so how do you fix that? Well, this is one way to do that, that you provide that clarity to the Department of Education, who up to this point, at least in this administration, hasn't their investigations are still ongoing, but they need that clarity, and I think this is a way to do it. Let states lead the way. 35 of them have done this, including in mine, on a unanimous vote. This is a good step in the right direction.
I want to thank the witnesses for testifying, and I yield back.
Sure. Thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. Generally from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I obviously join with my colleagues in condemning the explosion in anti-Semitism that we've seen across this country and share their interest in trying to address the issue with some actual solutions. But I'm really concerned that this bill repeats what we've seen so many times in this Congress. We're seeing the House Republican majority trying to exploit real problems to divide people and score political points rather than providing actual solutions. This bill doesn't solve anything. It doesn't do anything to stop the rise of anti-Semitism. It will probably make it harder for the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, which is the most effective tool we have for combating discrimination against Jewish students. It'll make it harder for OCR to do its job with respect to anti-Semitism, as well as religious, racial, gender, and disability discrimination. So rather than pushing this weak, divisive bill, I'm more interested in hearing about a bill that could have been put up for consideration. That's H.R. 7921, which was introduced jointly in the House and the Senate by bipartisan chairs of the Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism. And this bill establishes a national coordinator to oversee an agency or a task force on countering anti-Semitism. It would combat domestic anti-Semitism, ensure coordination among federal agencies. It would require FEMA to guarantee that the agency has the resources needed to operate the nonprofit security grant program, which is so important. Every synagogue in, I think, all of our districts is required in this day and age to have security, police presence, simply to hold services on a weekly basis. So that bill seems like a much more bipartisan, solution-oriented, useful bill, and I was wondering, Mr. Nadler, could you comment upon that bill?
Well, that's the Manning bill. It's a bipartisan bill. I forget who the lead Republican sponsor is. It is a whole approach. It codifies the whole of government anti-Semitic strategy of the administration, which, as far as I know, all Jewish leaders in this country support. And that's a far better bill. It actually does something It actually does something. This bill does nothing. This bill codifies into law a definition and rejects other definitions, and it codifies a definition which the author of the definition says shouldn't be codified. The real question, beyond the Manning bill, is the appropriation for the Office of Civil Rights to enforce Title VI. That is the most important thing. Frankly, it's more important than the Manning bill, although that's a very important thing too. But the most important thing is to appropriate the funding to enable the Department of Justice to respond to the huge increase in anti-Semitic incidents. FBI Administrator Wray quoted the statistics I quote, cited statistics I quoted before about the huge increase of anti-Semitism, and there has not been a commensurate increase in the budget to do the investigations. In fact, there's been basically no increase at all. The administration has tried to greatly increase it. The Republicans, both in the last budget and the current budget, proposed a 25% cut in the enforcement mechanism, and the compromise this past in FY24 was no change, even though the number of incidents and of complaints that have to be investigated is skyrocketing. I hope the most important thing that we could do, even beyond the Manning bill, is to go along with it, is to grant the increase in appropriation for the Office of Civil Rights to enforce Title VI, to enforce discrimination, the prohibition against discrimination against Jews and other people in higher education, and to increase that budget commensurately as the administration has asked.
And you raised, in that discussion, you raised another interesting point, which is that this bill, under consideration today, is actually opposed by multiple Jewish American organizations in addition to the ACLU. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Don't ask me for them off the top of my head, but it is.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, Chair. Thanks, the gentlelady. The gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not going to ask a whole lot of questions. I just want to tell you that I appreciate you bringing the bill forward, because what's happening around our country and what's happening on college campuses in particular is scary. And I think I appreciate that you are moving something forward to help our Jewish brothers and sisters with this. So thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, Chair. Thanks, the gentlelady. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for questions.
The anti-Semitism experienced by Jewish students on college campuses is very worrisome. Mr. Fry, I appreciate the fact that you've been watching the TV coverage, but I've actually talked to college students, to Jewish students, and I've heard firsthand some of the anti-Semitism, and it breaks my heart. I have sat through numerous hearings in the Education Committee where all we do is talk about this. We don't do anything about it. And that's the problem, is that the way to do something about this problem is to fund the agency that actually would investigate and hold colleges accountable. And every time we ask to do something like that, we don't get it. And in fact, the Republicans propose cutting the agency, as we've talked about today. That's it. We can't just complain. We actually have to fund the agencies that would do the work. Now, with regards to the definition itself, I think there are problems. And Ranking Member Nadler, I think one of the reasons why it's opposed codifying it is because things do change. And there is also a concern about criticism of Israel becoming equated with anti-Semitism, and isn't that one of the reasons why many Jewish organizations are worried?
Yes, that's exactly right. And let me give you a list of Jewish organizations who are opposing H.R. 6090. J Street, the Nexus Project, Jewish Council for Public Affairs, TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, Bend the Arc, Jewish Action, and the New Israel Fund. In addition to that, other organizations that are that have opposed codifying IRA in the past are Americans for Peace Now, Aleph, Alliance for Jewish Renewal, New Israel Fund, Partners for Progressive Israel, and Reconstructionist Judaism. So all these Jewish organizations oppose this bill or oppose codifying IRA, which is what this bill does.
Right. And I think that's really important that we're actually hearing, and it's not universal, it's not unanimous, but we're hearing from Jewish organizations, they do not want this codified because they recognize they themselves might want to be able to criticize Israel, because not all believe that Netanyahu has done a remarkable job. In fact, many criticize what Netanyahu has done. He has not done a remarkable job in many eyes. And I think that it's also really important to remember that we need to fund the Office of Civil Rights, because anti-Semitism is not new. Anti-Semitism is a centuries-old problem, and it's rooted in white supremacy. And white supremacy takes aim at many different peoples. And white supremacy and the people who espouse white supremacy are given a platform by some in the Republican Party. Mr. Chair, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record the article from Politico titled "Donald Trump Dined with White Nationalist Holocaust Denier Rick Fuentes."
Without objection, so ordered.
And, Ranking Member, you also pointed out the fact that Trump was not critical of the very anti-Semitic remarks in Charlottesville. Mr. Chair, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into record the article from the Atlantic titled "Trump Defends White Nationalist Protesters," open quote, "some very fine people on both sides," close quote.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Fry, would you condemn the white nationalist who protested in Charlottesville?
I think that's unequivocal, yes.
We should all condemn that. And I think that's the problem, is that we do not have widespread condemnation of white nationalists from the Republican Party at this point in time. As I said before, I believe that we need to fund the agency. I believe that we need to address anti-Semitism. I spoke in favor of Kathy Manning's bill in the department, in our committee hearing, because that's where we start, with a comprehensive effort and not with something that has these problematic provisions in it. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky for questions.
Thank you, Chairman. So when I heard we were going to pass a bill that was going to define anti-Semitism, I got kind of encouraged, because I've seen it defined 1,000 different ways, but then I go into this bill and I see there's actually no definition of anti-Semitism here. Mr. Fry, why? I know it says it adopts the IHRA definition, but why not just put that definition in the legislation?
You know, I'm not the chief sponsor of the bill. I'm a co-sponsor of it. I think the reference, and I think you see this in other laws, certainly in my experience, that they reference certain things. So the reference, I think, suffices in my opinion. But I think the definition plus the examples that they give out pretty clearly gives, I think, some guidance to the Department of Education to look at this issue when they're examining complaints that are happening on college campuses.
So are the examples incorporated into this bill as well?
I believe so, but I may be I'm speaking off the top of my head. I believe so, yes.
So, because the definition, I mean, I think it would behoove us to actually put the definition in the bill. I don't know why you wouldn't stick it in there. It's, I think it's one sentence long, if I found the definition itself on the website correctly. And then there are a lot of examples, which I suspect could change over time. And I actually agree with Ranking Member Nadler that some of these examples may be anti-Semitism, but they may not be in a different context. They're just not clear enough without the context around each of those examples. And yes, Mr. Nadler, would you like to speak to that?
That is why the chief author of the IRA definition, Ken Stern, said don't codify it. It should be regarded, it should be consulted, as should the other two definitions, which this bill specifically says don't consult. But the Jerusalem definition and the Nexus definition should be consulted. The IRA definition should be consulted, but none of them should be codified for exactly the reason you said. And that's the reason why the main author of the IRA definition has said, Ken Stern has said, don't codify it.
In fact, when I go to the website where this is stored, it says adopt, on 26 May 2016, plenary in Bucharest decided to adopt the following non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism. And then there's the definition, it's one sentence. And then I find a bunch of examples, which again, may or may not be anti-Semitic, depending on the context, I think. Mr. Fry, in your opening statements, I think you accurately characterized a lot of things that have gone on around the country, but I'm not sure that they are, that they should be used to characterize this bill, because you were talking about students and things that students had done, but we're also hearing that this bill doesn't bind students, it binds the faculty or the administration. Does this, so for instance, you said there were physical attacks. Aren't physical attacks already illegal? And why would we need a definition of anti-Semitism?
Physical attacks, assault, battery, things like that are usually statutory at the state and federal level.
So, okay, so I mean, I know you referenced physical attacks, and I thought to myself, well, we don't need this bill to define anti-Semitism to deal with physical attacks, because those are already crimes, assault and whatnot. And then you referenced a case where students were arrested for trespassing only to be released and returned to campus. Did you reference that because you thought they should have been expelled or not returned to campus?
I'm sorry, will you repeat the question?
I think in part of your opening testimony, you related a story where, I'm not sure which university it was, but you said students were arrested for trespassing only to be later released and they returned to campus. Did you bring up that story because you think this bill would affect those students, that they wouldn't later be returned to campus if this bill passed?
I think the bill, if you look at the text of it, the bill is about the universities themselves, under the Civil Rights Act, under Title VI. And so the purpose of it in the text is that the Department of Education will take into consideration, of course, their existing statutory authority, but borrowing and using the definition with the IHRA, that would help to guide and shape their decisions on whether these things are happening on their campus. And of course, we apply this standard all across the board, not with this specific definition, but to race and to gender and to things like that. But I think this provides that guidance to the Department of Education on when they're assessing these things that are happening on their campus and their response or lack of response to them.
So would more students be arrested because this passes, or fewer students be arrested, or would, what do you think the result of this bill would be?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that this is how colleges govern themselves is answerable certainly to the president of the college and to the foundation and any number of entities at state and private level. But this is when the Department of Education is examining under Title VI whether these things are happening or not. The definition provides that guidance to determine or to ascertain whether these things are happening.
Okay, I hope you don't think my question is unfair. In your opening testimony, you said students were arrested, and I wondered how that related to the bill. Ranking Member Nadler.
Yeah, thank you. The bill would not increase or decrease the number of students or anybody else arrested at all. The bill, as I said, codifies one definition of anti-Semitism, a definition that the author says shouldn't be codified. And then it has this paragraph, if you want to look on page 4, section 5, or subsection 5, says, the use of alternative definitions of anti-Semitism impairs enforcement efforts by adding multiple standards and may fail to identify many of the modern manifestations of anti-Semitism, unquote. Now, there are two alternative definitions. The Jerusalem Declaration, made by, I think, 130 scholars in Jerusalem, or a convocation in Jerusalem, and the Nexus definition, I forget what Nexus stands for. All three of these definitions are basically examples. They're guidance and examples. and to say, none of which should be codified. But to codify one and say, don't look at the other two makes no sense at all.
So one of the examples that's listed on the website that has the definition, again, I'm troubled that we're not putting the definition in law. I have to rely on somebody's website to go find out what we're going to be making into law. But one of the examples they have in there is, which on its face you would think, yeah, that's anti-Semitism, perhaps, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, they give as an example. If somebody on campus said that Netanyahu's policies are leading to a de facto genocide of Palestinians, is that anti-Semitic? Is that an example of this example?
Well, I think what I would refer back to is where it says that criticism of Israel, just as a nation, similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. And so I think when the Department of Education conceptually or hypothetically is looking at a case, that criticism of the country or Netanyahu or whoever the prime minister may be isn't by itself definitive of anti-Semitism.
I saw that, and I was encouraged by that because we passed a law here in Congress that I voted against. I'm sorry, it was a non-binding resolution that passed that I think Mr. Nadler and I were on the same side of. It said that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Now, there may be, again, depending on the context, there are probably a lot of anti-Semitic people who are anti-Zionist, but the opposite isn't necessarily true, and I think we were wrong in this body to pass a resolution trying to absolutely equate the two. They're in the same zip code a lot of times, but you can't absolutely equate the two. So I was encouraged when I went to the website that this law references and found that it said what you just said, which is criticism of Israel isn't per se or on its face or necessarily anti-Semitic, but then it gives several examples of where criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. So that caused me some confusion. So for instance, if you accuse Israel as a state of exaggerating the Holocaust, and nobody here denies the Holocaust and it was terrible and it was large scale and massive, but if somebody wrote an academic paper trying to actually get to the actual number and maybe they found evidence of another or some kind of evidence to get a better number of it, is that anti-Semitic if they publish that paper criticizing Israel?
No, I think what's important here, Mr. Massey, and this is why I like the definition, is that it says, before it starts listing out the specific examples, it says contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, the media, schools, the workplace, and in the religious sphere could, taking into account the overall context, include but are not limited to. And again, I think this goes to the Department of Education. It doesn't say that all these things isolated by themselves rise to the level of anti-Semitism, but it does say when you look at these specific examples, taking into the overall context of what is happening on University X or College Y, that these things could be considered anti-Semitism.
I find it interesting that that's almost a restatement of what Mr. Nadler said in opposition to such a rigid definition, is that the context matters. And that would be my position too, and I think that's why it's dangerous to take one definition from one organization and say this is the only definition, and here are their examples, which I'm not...
Especially when the author said don't do it.
Right, when the person who's responsible for curating the definition asked people not to do it, that's correct. I think it is dangerous. Is it, I've read the definition here, I'm still left with some questions. Would it be anti-Semitic to say that AIPAC should register under the FARA?
I think, again, this is about college campuses and universities and how the Department of Education will examine issues related to those colleges. I don't think the bill seeks to do nothing but direct the Department of Education. I don't think it touches on the other facets of.
But if a professor of political science at one of these universities said that AIPAC is clearly an agent of a foreign country, they've got one single issue, which is to advocate for a better American-Israeli relationship, which usually means giving Israel money, or passing one of 36 bills that we've passed here since Mike Johnson became Speaker, or non-binding resolutions or amendments that deals with Israel. So if a political science professor at one of these universities said, do you know, the Foreign Agent Registration Act clearly applies to AIPAC, and he taught his students that, would that be an example of anti-Semitism that's being promoted at a university?
I think what's important, Mr. Massey, is that the definition itself, when you look at the definition, again, I'm not the Department of Education, and I wouldn't be an employee there waiting in on whether that was anti-Semitic or not. But the definition says that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. And then it goes on to list certain things. But what is, I would say, important, an important mission for the Department of Education is that it says that when you take your example, but you take into account the overall context of that professor, that gives the Department of Education, I keep wanting to say energy, but the Department of Education sufficient guidance. Not only do you have Title VI and what it says, and all the cases that have come out of Title VI over the years, but you have this definition that expressly incorporates the IHRA's definition, which is broad at the top, but then lists certain things. What's important to me from a free speech aspect is that you have the text of the bill itself that protects the civil liberties. You have the definition itself, which says that criticism of Israel isn't necessarily anti-Semitic, and that you have to review these things in the context in which they are brought before the Department of Education.
What I was hoping for is you could read that definition and tell me a few examples, if I gave them to you, of whether they're anti-Semitic or not. Like, for instance, is it anti-Semitic to say that AIPAC should register under FARA?
I mean, I think that's again, me personally, I think that's a free speech issue. But again, the purpose of the bill is the context in which this is provided when you are examining the actions of a university or inactions of a university in propping this up.
Yeah, and tell her I've got a few more questions. Yeah, I know my mic's hot. You can tell Kelly I'm still asking questions. So, you know, I didn't vote for one of these resolutions that came to the floor. This is why I'm reluctant. I mean, I intend to vote for the rule, but we're just getting worn out by these resolutions. We've done 3 dozen now since Mike Johnson became Speaker, and we've sliced it and diced it every way you can do it. Everybody's introduced, almost at this point, a bill to deal with something along these lines since October 7th. None of them actually get to anything real. I think it's a political ping pong game. Of course, we get to serve every time, and a lot of these are just political traps. I call them sticky traps, designed to split the Democrat Party and get them stuck in the sticky trap, and I've gotten stuck in almost every one of them myself because I believe absolutely in the First Amendment, and I don't vote for foreign aid. And I actually think a lot of people here are a little bit xenophobic with all of their resolutions against other countries and all of the sanctions against these other countries, so I've never voted for a sanction. So every one of these bills that comes forward, we hope to get the Democrats in the sticky trap. And I always end up there. And then I ended up with, for voting no against one of these, $90,000 of ads run against me in my district by AIPAC, by their super PAC, because I didn't vote for one of these resolutions. And I think it's ridiculous. And I said, now I'm going to get, again, back to the subject matter. I want you to tell me if this is anti-Semitic, because they said it was. I said, AIPAC always gets mad when I put America first. I won't be voting for their $14 billion shakedown of American taxpayers either. Let them know what you think by replying to their post. They are intentionally misrepresenting my intent and the resolution I voted against. So AIPAC comes back and says that I've made charges of dual loyalty, which is another trope which is mentioned in these examples, which again, it depends on the context, I believe, on whether that's anti-Semitic or not. But here they said charges of dual loyalty are anti-Semitic and insult millions of patriotic Americans who stand by Israel. They said that when I said America should come first, they said I was invoking an anti-Semitic trope. And I just want to know, do you think that was anti-Semitic, Mr. Fry, for me to say that America comes first and that's why I didn't vote for the money?
Mr. Massey, you and I have had multiple discussions, and we share many views, particularly on the college campus free speech aspect of this. What I would say is that you as a member have every right to express that. I don't think you're anti-Semitic in the least. I think you're a pretty good guy. I disagree with you, at least on this particular bill for sure, because I do think it's important that you provide that information. And what was intriguing to me when I was personally reviewing the bill, in the State House, we did a lot of stuff to augment free speech rights. In Congress, I feel like I'd like to do the same. I think clarity is incredibly important. And we've had a lot of people talk about funding the Civil Rights Division. Those debates happen between R's and D's and any number of individuals all the time about the scope of what they do. What's important is that I think you have to define these things. And so if the Department of Education, in my view, has had an inconsistent review of problems that have arisen at college campuses, it's important to make sure that the mission is something that Congress stamps on, that it's not just some executive order or rule that they, whether it's through a bill, through an amendment, whatever the case is. But to answer your question in short, I think you're a pretty good guy.
Well, thank you. I think you're a good guy, too. And I also want to agree with you. I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm not xenophobic. I'm not racist. I'm not any of those things. In fact, every time we vote to do something to another country, I vote against it. Or every time we vote to do something to or for a class of people, I vote against it. Every life is precious and nobody is special, in my view. And I just, before we close, I want to say, Ranking Member Nadler, I'm glad to see the vestiges of the anti-war left and the First Amendment free speech left aren't completely gone here in this chamber. And I appreciate your viewpoint, and I yield back.
Sure. Thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will try not to be as long-winded as some in here are. I would say this. Speech that's designed to intimidate is not free speech. And sometimes free speech can end up in a disagreement. But what's happening on these college campuses, that's not freedom of speech. It is designed to intimidate. Ultimately, it's theft by having classes taken away from people who have paid for them. And, you know, I honestly think some of it's being paid for. I think it's intentional, and I think it is being egged on by many of the enemies of this country. I don't think it is just anti-Israel. I think it is anti-American. I have seen on the last several bills that we have taken up, Mr. Chairman, I have seen a statement of administrative policies on 615, 764, 2925, 3195, 3397. Is there a reason that we don't have a statement of administrative policies on this piece of legislation from the Biden administration?
The gentleman should refer that question to the Biden administration.
Sir?
I think you need to direct that question to the Biden administration. The chair's not responsible.
Okay, well, I just think it's interesting that the Biden administration has given us a pretty blunt statement of administrative policies on all of the pieces of legislation so far that we've discussed, and yet they've stayed away from this particular piece of legislation, and I think that says a lot about the administration.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
So we were asked to accept a unanimous consent request about then President Trump's remarks about Charlottesville. I would also just like to enter into the record President Biden's comments about good people on both sides, because I think what you're bringing up reflects the fact that they don't know quite where they are on this. So I'm going
Yes,
to ask
sir.
unanimous consent to add this to the record as well.
But I would, if I had it in front of me, I'd ask to submit for the record the CNN poll that shows that President Trump is actually leading President Biden. And the reason he's leading him is because most Americans know things like this are not freedom of speech, and they want it stopped in this country. And so, again, I won't belabor the point of where we are, but I do want to suggest that, Mr. Fry, am I correct that there are 46 co-sponsors plus Mr. Lawler, the original sponsor? Is that correct?
That is my understanding, yes, sir.
And 13 of the co-sponsors are Democrat.
That's correct. And Mr. Scott, and you were behind me when I was facing here, so I'm not sure when you came in, but I will say that this bill, this exact bill, just passed in the South Carolina General Assembly unanimously. So again, I don't know what the other margins are in these other states, but it's only partisan when you cross the Potomac, it seems like.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I again, what is happening on these college campuses, it is designed to intimidate. It is designed to shut down the schools. It is theft. It is not only anti-Israel, I believe it's anti-American. I hope that they're able to identify those, and any of them who have carried out any act of violence, if they're here on a student visa, that visa should be revoked, and they should have to pay for their own plane ticket home. With that, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, thanks, gentlemen. I want to thank both our witnesses for their lengthy time before us today, your thoughtful comments. The witnesses are excused.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And we do have another panel, so I would call up Mr. What? Committee will come to order. Chair will be in receipt from a motion from the gentleman from Kentucky. Thomas, order. We have amendments to get through. So Mr. Stauber and Mr. Graves. Very well. Mr. Stauber, you're recognized to speak on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to be very brief on these two amendments. The first is, it's just a simple manager's amendment that makes a technical correction to the Federal Register citation of the Biden administration's rule relating to, quote, management and protection of the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. That's a simple amendment. The amendment, number 17, it updates the underlying legislation to prevent the Biden administration from taking additional steps to block oil and gas production in Alaska. In the Bureau of Land